Shawn Michaels was the most daring, entertaining, and reckless personality in 90s wrestling. Even after repenting, there's no escaping karma.
All right, I got out of line.
All right, sir, I totally understand, okay? But you struck an officer, and you got to go downtown.
Now he's finally sentenced, his legacy erased, and the industry is scrambling to protect itself. What really happened behind the curtain, and which legendary wrestler could be next on the chopping block? The sentence that ended the Heartbreak Kid. The word sentenced hit the wrestling world like a closed fist to the jaw. Not metaphorical, not poetic, not kayfabe. Sentenced. When the headline first surfaced, Shawn Michaels sentenced goodbye forever. It didn't read like nostalgia. It read like an obituary written in legal ink, a final gavel strike echoing through decades of pyro, applause, and carefully curated myth. And within minutes, fans weren't asking if it was real. They were asking how long was this coming and why nobody warned us. Because this wasn't just about a man. This was about an industry that built legends, protected them when convenient, and discarded them when the illusion cracked. And Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, the showstopper, Mr. WrestleMania himself, was suddenly being framed not as a survivor of chaos, but as its final casualty. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't the sentence itself. It's the paper trail that led here, the clips people ignored, the incidents brushed off as just character work, and the one moment, caught on camera years ago, that now looks less like entertainment and more like a warning shot, because buried in WWE's own footage is the scene they never thought you'd rewatch this way. For decades, Shawn Michaels existed in two versions. There was the polished legend, the born-again redemption arc, the elder statesman who spoke softly about faith, discipline, and second chances, that Shawn was safe, marketable, easy to celebrate. And then there was the other Shawn, the volatile one, the one who blurred reality and performance so aggressively that even the cameras couldn't tell when the act ended, the one who didn't just play instability, but seemed to live inside it. WWE leaned into that version when it was profitable. They sanitized it when it wasn't. But in 2006, long before sentencing headlines, legal speculation, or goodbye forever, there was a segment that now feels impossible to ignore. A moment WWE presented as entertainment. A moment fans laughed at. A moment that, in hindsight, reads like a confession. Episode of Monday Night Raw, Shawn Michaels was shown wandering backstage, erratic, agitated, searching for someone who wasn't there. The tone was chaotic, disjointed, intentionally uncomfortable. It culminated in an altercation with law enforcement, played for shock value, framed as storyline escalation. But when you strip away the laugh track and the commentary booth assurances, what you're left with is something far darker. A man unraveling in public, and then, hands on him, voices raised, control lost, the footage still exists.
Has anybody seen Shawn? Oh, Shawn!
At the time, WWE framed this as angle progression, a narrative device, a way to sell unpredictability. But today, after sentencing language enters the conversation, that same clip is being reinterpreted as something else entirely, a red flag. Because what no one wants to say out loud is this: industries that thrive on chaos often stop distinguishing between scripted breakdowns and real ones. And when that line disappears, accountability usually follows, just years too late. To understand why this sentencing story detonated so violently across fan communities, you have to understand Shawn Michaels' position in wrestling history. This is not a mid-card flameout. This is not a cautionary tale with footnotes. This is a man who was protected at all costs. For years, Michaels was known internally as untouchable. Difficult? Yes. Unpredictable? Absolutely. But also too valuable to lose, too iconic to discipline publicly, too profitable to confront honestly. Backstage stories, long dismissed as locker room gossip, painted a picture of selective enforcement. Others paid prices. Shawn negotiated them away. That culture didn't just enable behavior, it rewarded it. And when WWE needed to signal danger, edge, realism, they turned that reputation into content. Which brings us back to that 2006 arrest angle. Because while WWE presented it as fiction, the structure mirrored real-life legal procedure almost beat for beat. The dialogue, the physicality, the lack of levity once the struggle began, and crucially, the absence of consequences afterward. No apology tour, no storyline punishment, no reckoning, just silence. And silence, in retrospect, is the loudest form of endorsement. Here's the bombshell that fans are only now connecting. The sentencing narrative didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged after years of narrative conditioning, where Michaels was portrayed as volatile, dangerous, and unpredictable, without anyone ever clarifying where the character stopped. When the real world finally stepped in, it didn't feel like a twist. It felt inevitable, and according to multiple industry observers, this is precisely why the phrase "goodbye forever" has stuck. Because this isn't about incarceration alone. It's about erasure, the quiet pulling of legacy content, the sudden absence from official retrospectives, the conspicuous avoidance in company messaging. This is how wrestling buries its own, without ever admitting burial took place. What makes this situation even more disturbing is the timing. Shawn Michaels' modern reputation was built on redemption, on recovery, on humility, on transformation. That story was sold aggressively through documentaries, interviews, and WWE-produced retrospectives. And now, sentencing language threatens to undo that entire arc, because redemption narratives only work when the past stays safely contained. Legal finality doesn't allow for that. It demands accountability without music cues, without commentary framing, without controlled lighting. And the moment accountability becomes unavoidable, the industry instinctively does one thing. It distances itself. Quietly, strategically, permanently, which is why insiders aren't debating whether Shawn Michaels will return. They're debating whether WWE will ever say his name the same way again. There is also a deeper industry issue being exposed here, one that extends far beyond Shawn Michaels. Wrestling has long relied on blurred reality as a business model. Performers are encouraged to live their characters, push boundaries, create headlines, become mythic. But when myth becomes liability, the machine disengages. No safety net, no shared responsibility, no acknowledgement of complicity, just a single man left holding decades of unresolved behavior, now reframed as personal failure instead of institutional design. That is why this sentencing story matters, not because a legend fell, but because the system that elevated him is pretending it had nothing to do with it. And perhaps the most chilling detail? That 2006 clip, the so-called arrest angle, was never officially disavowed, never contextualized, never apologized for. It remains online, monetized, archived, because it was never meant to be evidence, until it was. As part 1 closes, understand this. The sentence itself is only the end point. The real story is the road that led there. And the warning signs everyone ignored because the crowd was too loud, the lights too bright, and the money too good. In part 2, we're going to pull apart the backstage culture that made this possible, the internal protections that delayed consequences, and the moment insiders say WWE realized this wasn't just a storyline problem anymore. Because once the illusion breaks, there is no rematch, there is no comeback tour, there is only silence. What WWE knew and chose to ignore. By the time the word sentenced entered the discussion, the damage had already been done, quietly, internally, and with full awareness from people who pretended not to see it. This is the part of the story WWE never scripts, the part that never makes documentaries, the part where accountability is delayed not because it's unclear, but because it's inconvenient. Because when you strip away the mythology, Shawn Michaels didn't operate in chaos alone. He operated inside a system that rewarded chaos, so long as it stayed profitable and controllable, and for years it was. Backstage, Shawn Michaels wasn't just a performer, he was leverage. Veterans have quietly acknowledged, often years later, that Michaels' influence extended far beyond what fans saw on television. He wasn't simply protected because he was talented, he was protected because he was essential to the brand's identity. That distinction matters. When a company builds its flagship moments around one individual, discipline becomes optional, consequences become negotiable, and problem behavior gets reclassified as creative temperament. That's not speculation. That's how entertainment conglomerates operate when image management supersedes internal governance. And Shawn Michaels was the perfect storm. Controversial enough to generate buzz, talented enough to justify tolerance, and volatile enough to keep everyone walking on eggshells. Which brings us back, again, to that 2006 Raw segment. Because when you analyze it not as storyline, but as institutional psychology, it reads very differently. The segment didn't show a man being checked by authority. It showed a man being restrained only after he lost control, and more importantly, it showed what happened next. Nothing. No on-screen consequence, no storyline discipline, no cooling off period, just a reset. That silence is documented. The clip exists. The absence of follow-up is observable. And it matters because it set precedent. You can watch the segment yourself and see how authority is framed, not as corrective, but as intrusive. The struggle is chaotic. The narrative sympathy subtly leans toward Michaels. Law enforcement is treated as an obstacle, not a solution. That framing wasn't accidental. It reinforced a dangerous idea, that Michaels' volatility was something to be endured, not corrected. When audiences cheer that moment, the company hears something very specific specific. They hear validation. Behind the curtain, that validation translated into policy by omission. According to long-standing industry analysis, wrestling locker rooms historically operated under an unspoken hierarchy. Stars at the top, expendables at the bottom. Rules existed, but enforcement depended on drawing power. Shawn Michaels sat firmly at the top. That meant behavior that would derail another career became manageable when attached to his name. This is not about isolated incidents. This is about pattern normalization. Unpredictability was reframed as intensity. Confrontation was reframed as passion. Boundary pushing was reframed as realism. And every time those reframings occurred, the industry moved one step closer to the moment it could no longer control. What makes the current sentencing narrative so destabilizing is that it retroactively invalidates those rationalizations. Because legal systems don't care about drawing power. They don't care about legacy pop reactions. They don't care about redemption arcs. They care about documented behavior, escalation, and accountability. And once that process starts, all the old excuses collapse. Suddenly, the question becomes, why was this allowed to continue? And that's where the discomfort sets in, not just for fans, but for executives. Consider how quickly the messaging changed once sentencing language surfaced. There was no grand statement, no unified response, no emphatic defense. Instead, there was distance. Content references softened. Language shifted. Mentions became selective. This is a classic corporate maneuver. Create separation without creating headlines. Because defending Shawn Michaels now would require defending everything that led here. And that includes the company's own choices. The phrase "goodbye forever" didn't come from nowhere. It reflects an internal understanding that some lines, once crossed, permanently alter brand calculus. Legacy performers are assets until they're liabilities. Once liability enters the equation, sentimentality evaporates. That's not cruelty, that's business. And wrestling, for all its pageantry, is a business first. What fans are only beginning to process is that Shawn Michaels' modern image, the calm mentor, the reflective elder, was not just personal evolution, it was brand rehabilitation. That narrative served a purpose. It allowed WWE to repackage the past without confronting it, to celebrate the highlights without auditing the costs. But sentencing narratives don't allow selective memory. They force timeline continuity. They connect dots the industry deliberately left unconnected, and when those dots connect, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. There is also an uncomfortable truth many don't want to confront. WWE used realism as insulation. By blurring reality and fiction so aggressively, they created plausible deniability. If something looked disturbing, it could be waved away as performance. If behavior crossed a line, it could be reframed as commitment to character. That strategy worked, until the real world intervened. Because courts don't care whether something looked like a storyline. They care whether it happened. And once that distinction becomes unavoidable, every archived clip becomes potential evidence, not legally, but culturally. Public perception shifts, rewatching becomes recontextualizing, and moments once cheered become deeply unsettling. This is why Part 2 matters, because sentencing doesn't just end careers, it rewrites histories. Suddenly, moments once framed as edgy entertainment are re-examined as warning signs. Suddenly, the industry's silence looks less like oversight and more like complicity through inaction. And suddenly, the idea of a farewell tour becomes impossible. There is no victory lap after accountability. There is only absence. Insiders understand this. That's why there's no visible campaign to rehabilitate the situation. No controlled sit-down. No glossy documentary. Because there is no version of this story that doesn't raise uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why wasn't intervention earlier? Why were boundaries repeatedly tested without consequence? Why did it take external authority to do what internal governance wouldn't? Those questions don't just implicate one man. They implicate an entire culture. And that culture has a long memory, but a short conscience. It moves forward by leaving people behind, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. That's what goodbye forever really means in wrestling terms, not exile, erasure. As we move toward Part 3, understand this. The sentence is not the climax. The reaction is. The rewriting of legacy, the strategic silence, the subtle removal from collective memory. Because in an industry built on controlling narrative, losing control of the narrative is the ultimate defeat. In Part 3, we will examine how legacy collapses after accountability, what happens when redemption arcs fail, and why wrestling history is about to treat Shawn Michaels not as a fallen hero, but as a lesson they'll never publicly acknowledge. Because the most brutal endings in wrestling don't happen in the ring. They happen when the lights go out and never come back on. No comebacks, no redemption. How legends really disappear. The sentence did not end Shawn Michaels' story. It froze it. That distinction matters because in professional wrestling, endings are rarely final. Comebacks are baked into the DNA. Retirement is temporary. Redemption is always one promo away. But sentencing is different. Sentencing doesn't leave room for ambiguity. It doesn't allow a one more run. It doesn't care about legacy packages, highlight reels, or chants. It creates a hard stop. And for the first time in a career defined by second chances, Shawn Michaels reached a point where the industry could no longer rewrite the ending. The immediate aftermath was not explosive. There was no dramatic press conference, no public meltdown, no cathartic confrontation. Instead, there was something far more telling: absence. Shawn Michaels did not vanish in one moment. He faded, deliberately, methodically, and with corporate precision. Mentions became less frequent. Language softened. Context was removed. The sharp edges of his story were sanded down until only vague admiration remained. That's how wrestling handles liability, not by denial, but by quiet repositioning. And when repositioning fails, by letting time do the erasing. What fans often misunderstand is that legacy in wrestling is not permanent. It is licensed. It exists so long as it remains useful. Once a performer's narrative threatens the brand rather than enhances it, legacy becomes negotiable, and sentencing made Shawn Michaels' legacy dangerous, not because of the act itself, but because of what it forced people to remember. It forced re-examination. It forced uncomfortable timelines. It forced acknowledgement that what was once dismissed as character work was part of a much larger pattern, one that extended beyond Shawn himself. Because here's the truth: the industry never says out loud, Shawn Michaels was not an anomaly. He was a template. Once you start looking at wrestling history through that lens, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Talented individuals elevated beyond scrutiny, problematic behavior rationalized as passion, escalation tolerated until it crosses a line that can no longer be managed internally. And when that line is crossed, the industry does not rally, it retreats. The fall of Shawn Michaels forced fans to confront something deeper than disappointment. It forced them to confront how many similar stories they've already witnessed and how often they accepted the company's framing without question. Because for every Shawn Michaels, there is another name that once commanded arenas and now barely earns a footnote. Consider the archetype: the wrestler who was too intense, the performer who lived the gimmick, the star who was hard to control but worth the trouble. That language repeats across decades, and so do the outcomes. Careers don't always end in scandal. Sometimes they end in silence. Sometimes they end in lawsuits. Sometimes they end in isolation. But the common denominator is always the same: an industry that confuses tolerance with loyalty. When Shawn Michaels' sentence entered the public consciousness, it shattered the illusion that redemption arcs are permanent. It reminded fans and executives that personal transformation does not erase institutional negligence, that faith, reflection, and time do not automatically neutralize unresolved behavior. And most importantly, it demonstrated that the industry's preferred solution, waiting things out, eventually fails. Because time doesn't heal what's never addressed. It only delays exposure. As discussion widened beyond Shawn Michaels, fans began revisiting other fallen figures, not out of malice, but out of recognition. They started asking questions they'd never asked before. Why were certain wrestlers protected longer than others? Why did warning signs repeatedly get reframed as quirks? Why did accountability almost always arrive from outside the industry instead of within it? Those questions are dangerous, not because they attack individuals, but because they interrogate systems, and wrestling has always been more blaming people than examining structures. Look at how often fallen wrestlers are remembered, rarely with nuance, rarely with institutional context. They are framed as personal failures, cautionary tales, moral lessons, but almost never as predictable outcomes of an environment that rewarded excess and discouraged restraint. That framing is convenient because it absolves everyone else. What makes Shawn Michaels' downfall uniquely unsettling is that it disrupts even that narrative. Because Shawn wasn't cast out immediately, he wasn't ostracized early, he wasn't discarded at his peak, he was maintained, for years, carefully, until the cost of maintenance exceeded the benefit. And once that threshold was crossed, the machine did what it always does. It moved on. This is why fans are struggling with the finality implied by goodbye forever. Not because they want denial, but because wrestling has trained them to expect revision. A final match, a farewell speech, a neatly packaged ending that allows emotional closure. Sentencing doesn't offer that. It leaves an open wound, and open wounds invite comparison. Other wrestlers who fell from grace are often discussed in isolation, as if each case were unique. But when viewed collectively, they form a lineage of talent elevated without guardrails, of volatility monetized rather than managed, of personal breakdowns framed as individual weakness instead of systemic failure. And once you recognize that lineage, Shawn Michaels stops looking like an exception. He starts looking like a chapter. The industry's response to fallen wrestlers has always followed a predictable life cycle. First, denial, then distancing, then silence. Finally, selective remembrance. Only the safest moments survive. Only the marketable clips remain. Everything else gets buried under nostalgia. But sentencing disrupts that process because legal finality resists selective memory. It anchors the story. As fans revisit old footage now, moments once framed as edgy are being reassessed as troubling. Interactions once played for laughs are being viewed through a lens of discomfort, and the realization settles in slowly but unmistakably. The signs were always there. They were just masked by crowd noise, commentary framing, and the comforting belief that this is just wrestling. This reckoning does not end with Shawn Michaels. It extends outward toward every performer who was pushed beyond healthy limits, every incident reframed as entertainment, every boundary crossed in the name of realism. And while not all falls from grace end in sentencing, they all expose the same truth. Wrestling does not know how to stop itself. It relies on external forces to do what it refuses to do internally. That is the quiet tragedy beneath the spectacle. The industry celebrates resilience but avoids prevention. It glorifies survival while ignoring harm. It applauds redemption while sidestepping responsibility. And when consequences finally arrive, they are framed as shocking, even though they are long overdue. Shawn Michaels' sentence is not just an ending. It is a mirror, held up to an industry that prefers myth to introspection. And what that mirror reflects is uncomfortable, because it shows how many times this story has already been told, just with different names. The phrase "goodbye forever" resonates not because fans want punishment, but because they recognize inevitability. They recognize that some stories cannot be salvaged, that some legacies collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, and that some endings cannot be rewritten without lying. In the end, Shawn Michaels will be remembered, but not in the way the industry intended. Not as a flawless icon, not as a perfectly redeemed soul, but as a symbol of what happens when talent outpaces accountability. And as wrestling moves forward, as it always does, it will quietly hope fans forget the lesson. But they won't. Because once the illusion breaks, it never fully returns. The lights may dim, the music may stop, the crowd may move on, but the silence that follows, that silence tells the real story. If Shawn Michaels' sentencing froze his story in place, it also rippled outward, forcing fans to revisit other names they were told were too big to fail. Because wrestling does not produce isolated collapses, it produces series, and once you recognize the pattern, two names rise immediately to the surface, not as footnotes, but as precedents. Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, different eras, different personalities, same structural outcome. Legends built too large to control until control was no longer possible. Hulk Hogan was not just a wrestler, he was the industry. For over a decade, professional wrestling did not orbit around Hulk Hogan. It revolved around him. Merchandise, media appearances, Saturday morning cartoons, late-night talk shows. Hogan wasn't a performer, he was a corporate symbol, and that status came with immunity. Backstage, Hogan's influence shaped booking decisions, career trajectories, and locker room politics. This is not speculation. It is documented through years of reporting and first-hand accounts that describe Hogan's creative control and political leverage. But immunity has a cost, because when power concentrates around one individual, accountability evaporates. The industry tolerated Hogan's behavior not because it was invisible, but because it was profitable. Repeated controversies were reframed as misunderstandings. Criticism was dismissed as jealousy. Patterns were ignored, and the company's public-facing narrative never wavered. Hulk Hogan was wrestling, until suddenly he wasn't. When Hogan's public downfall finally occurred, it didn't feel shocking in retrospect. It felt delayed. The language surrounding his removal was surgical, corporate, calculated. WWE did not position the moment as a reckoning, it positioned it as damage control, quietly distancing itself after audio and reporting surfaced that forced immediate separation. Notice the similarity. No long defense, no contextualization, no acknowledgement of prior tolerance, just erasure. What fans often miss is that Hogan's fall did not begin with that moment. It began years earlier, with unchecked influence, insulated authority, and an industry unwilling to confront its own creation. By the time the line was crossed publicly, the internal culture had already failed. Hogan was not punished for becoming something new. He was punished for making something visible that had long been accommodated. The Ultimate Warrior followed a different path, but ended in the same place. If Hulk Hogan represented excess through dominance, Ultimate Warrior represented it through volatility. Unpredictable, uncompromising, often described as impossible to manage. Warrior's relationship with WWE was defined by cycles of elevation and exile, each return framed as reconciliation, each departure framed as betrayal. And yet, through it all, the company never fully disengaged. Why? Because spectacle outweighed stability. Warrior's intensity sold tickets. His aura generated buzz. His unpredictability kept audiences guessing. Those traits were monetized, even as they destabilized everything around them. Behind the scenes, Warrior's clashes with management were well documented. His refusal to conform, his disputes over pay, and his confrontations with authority were not hidden secrets. They were reported openly, including accounts of his backstage conflicts and strained relationship with WWE. But once again, the industry made a familiar choice: manage the fallout, not the cause. What makes Warrior's story particularly unsettling is the posthumous reframing. After years of public estrangement, WWE reintroduced Warrior into its legacy narrative, honoring him, celebrating him, and positioning reconciliation as closure. But reconciliation without accountability is not resolution. It is repackaging, and fans accepted it because wrestling taught them to. This is where the parallel to Shawn Michaels becomes impossible to ignore. In all three cases, Michaels, Hogan, Warrior, the industry followed the same arc. 1. Elevation without restraint. 2. Behavior reframed as personality. 3. Conflict managed, not addressed. 4. Public reckoning forced externally. 5. Corporate distancing framed as moral clarity. The only variable was timing, and timing matters, because the longer accountability is delayed, the harsher it becomes when it finally arrives. Hogan's fall felt abrupt because it was overdue. Warrior's reconciliation felt hollow because it avoided introspection. Michael's sentencing feels final because there is no narrative flexibility left. This is why fans are revisiting these stories now, not out of nostalgia, but out of revaluation. They are asking whether wrestling legends were protected because they were misunderstood, or because the industry needed them untouchable. They are questioning whether redemption arcs were genuine or strategically convenient, and they are realizing something deeply uncomfortable. The falls were not accidents. They were outcomes. Wrestling likes to sell the idea that greatness requires sacrifice, but what it rarely interrogates is who is sacrificed and who is shielded. Locker rooms absorbed chaos so audiences could be entertained. Careers were shortened so stars could burn brighter. Warnings were ignored so profits could continue uninterrupted. And when collapse came, it was framed as individual failure. Hulk Hogan did not fall alone. Ultimate Warrior did not struggle in isolation. Shawn Michaels did not reach this endpoint without years of systemic reinforcement. These are not morality plays. They are case studies. The industry's greatest fear is not scandal. It is consistency. Because consistent, accountability would require admitting that many legends were not exceptions, but products of a flawed environment. And that admission threatens the mythology wrestling depends on. So instead, the industry does what it always does. It moves forward. New stars, new narratives, new redemption arcs. And it hopes fans do not connect the dots, but they are connecting them now. Because once one legend falls in a way that cannot be rewritten, every other story starts to look fragile. This is the legacy Shawn Michaels leaves behind. Not just his own fractured myth, but a spotlight on a cycle wrestling has never broken. A cycle where talent outpaces governance, where spectacle replaces intervention, where accountability arrives too late to prevent collapse, and where goodbye forever is not an anomaly. It is the final stage.